Hello, gardening friends, and welcome back to Earthly Delights. Next time you walk through a grocery store, pick up a tub of ice cream, turn it over, and read the label closely. Chances are you will spot a small code most people never think twice about, E410. It shows up in everything from cream cheese and salad dressings to baby formula and frozen desserts. The food industry calls it locust bean gum, sometimes carob gum, but either way it comes from the seeds of one ancient tree. Now here is the part almost nobody tells you. The industry takes the seeds, uses them as a thickener, and largely ignores the rest of the pod, the part you can actually eat, the part that is naturally sweet, nourishing, and surprisingly close in flavor to chocolate. Somehow that whole story slipped out of everyday memory, and that should matter to people like us. If you are someone who loves growing useful plants, reading ingredient labels, improving your soil, filling your garden with trees that give back year after year, and finding practical ways to live a little closer to the land, then this is exactly the kind of plant story you need to hear. Because while the global chocolate business is worth well over $130 billion, it depends on a single fragile crop, cacao. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, a rugged survival tree has been quietly producing sweet pods for thousands of years with no caffeine, no heavy processing, and no mystery ingredients. In this video, I'm going to show you why this remarkable tree was overlooked, why it deserves a place in the future of sustainable growing, and how it could become one of the most rewarding plants you ever add to your home landscape. If you love discovering overlooked plants with real value, make sure you subscribe to Earthly Delights, and let's dig into this hidden harvest together. Part 1. The seeds that weighed the world. Before we talk about what this tree can do in a garden, or why it may matter so much in the future, we need to understand the kind of place it once held in the human story. And to do that, we need to look at something people have always valued: weight, trade, and wealth. The next time you see a diamond ring, remember this. The word carat traces back to the carob tree. In ancient Greek, the word karyoshin meant little horn, a reference to the shape of the pod, and over time it also became associated with the seed itself. That matters because merchants in the ancient world noticed something remarkable about carob seeds. Seed after seed, harvest after harvest, they were astonishingly consistent in weight, right around 0.2 grams. In a world long before digital scales and laboratory standards, that kind of natural reliability was not just useful, it was powerful. That is why 1 carat today is still defined as 200 milligrams. Every diamond measured anywhere in the world still carries a quiet echo of this tree. Just think about that for a moment. A humble Mediterranean pod helped shape the language and logic of value itself. Its seeds helped weigh gemstones, gold, and trade goods worth fortunes. Yet the tree behind that system faded into the background. Humanity kept the measurement, but somehow forgot the plant. And this was no minor roadside tree. The carob, Ceratonia siliqua, has been cultivated for thousands of years across the Mediterranean world. The Phoenicians grew it in lands where dry summers and hard soils challenged other crops. The Romans spread it through their empire, planting groves that could endure heat, neglect, and lean conditions. Early Christians later called it St. John's bread, tied to the belief that John the Baptist survived in the wilderness not on insects, but on the pods of the locust tree, carob pods. From there, the story kept moving. Spanish explorers and missionaries carried carob into the Americas, where it took root in California. Some of those old mission plantings still stand and still produce. That alone tells you something every grower understands deep in their bones. When a tree survives century after century, it is not just a crop, it is a legacy. So how did a tree that fed people, traveled empires, and even helped standardize wealth become something most people know only as a code on a food label? That is where the story takes a surprising turn, because history forgot carob long before nutrition science began to rediscover it. 2. The nutritional miracle versus the 1970s mistake. If you grew up around the health food movement of the 1970s, you may already know why carob developed such an unfortunate reputation. Back then, it was often handed to people, especially children, as the healthy version of chocolate. And that was the mistake. Because when you give someone a carob brownie and tell them to expect chocolate, you have already set carob up to lose. Chocolate delivers more than sweetness. It brings fat, bitterness, stimulation, and those familiar compounds like caffeine and theobromine that create part of the experience people crave. Carob plays a different game entirely. It is naturally sweeter, softer, rounder, and calmer. It does not hit the tongue or the nervous system the same way, so people felt disappointed, not because carob had no value, but because it was judged by the rules of another food. It was compared unfairly, and for decades it paid the price. But once you stop asking carob to imitate cacao, you begin to see what it really is. The pod is naturally rich in sugars, usually around 48 to 56%, mainly sucrose, glucose, and fructose. In plain terms, that means the sweetness is already there. No intense refining, no stimulant boost, no need to force it into becoming something else. And unlike cacao, carob contains zero caffeine and zero theobromine, the very compounds that make chocolate stimulating for people and problematic for dogs. From a grower's perspective, that is already fascinating, but nutritionally, the story goes deeper. The pod pulp contains valuable plant compounds such as polyphenols and flavonoids, along with minerals like potassium, calcium, and magnesium. In other words, this is not empty sweetness. It is a whole plant food with real structure and real substance behind it. And modern research has only made that picture more compelling. A 2024 analysis from the University of Salerno highlighted a wide range of promising health applications for carob. In one clinical study, participants who consumed just 4 grams of carob fiber a day for 4 weeks saw meaningful reductions in total cholesterol and triglycerides. That is a tiny amount over a short period of time from a food most people barely think about. On top of that, carob powder has been noted for having a very low glycemic index compared with pure sugar, which helps explain why its natural sweetness does not behave the same way metabolically. So the real question is not why carob failed in the 1970s. That part is easy. It failed because it was introduced as an imitation. The more interesting question is why we still overlook it now when we know it is naturally sweet, nutritionally useful, and remarkably well-suited to a changing world. And to answer that, we have to step back and look at the crop carob has spent the last century living beneath: cacao. Part 3. The fragility of the cacao monolith. To understand why carob was pushed aside, we have to look at the crop that took center stage. And that crop is cacao. For all its cultural power and global demand, modern chocolate rests on a surprisingly narrow foundation. By 2024, the global chocolate market had climbed to roughly $125 billion. Yet the raw material behind it comes from a tree that can only thrive within a thin tropical belt around the equator. Even more striking, about 70% of the world's cacao supply comes from West Africa. That is not resilience, that is dependence. And any grower knows what dependence like that means. When a food system leans too heavily on one climate zone, one weather pattern, and one vulnerable crop, it does not take much to shake the whole structure. That is exactly what happened when cocoa prices surged in early 2024, climbing to nearly $13,000 per ton, far above the normal range people had grown used to over the previous decade. This was not just a bad season or a passing market hiccup. It exposed a deeper weakness that had been building for years. Researchers looking at cacao production in places like Ghana found that the swings in yield were tied heavily to weather extremes. Too much rain in one part of the year, too much drought in another. In other words, the crop is being squeezed from both sides. Production in some regions has dropped sharply over just 2 years, And longer-term projections are even more unsettling, with scientists warning that a significant share of the world's cacao trees may become unproductive by mid-century if current trends continue. Then there is the environmental cost, which many people never stop to consider when they unwrap a chocolate bar. Producing chocolate at scale demands enormous water use, and the carbon footprint is far higher than most consumers would guess. Add in deforestation, transport, processing, refrigeration, and the pressures of monoculture farming, and what once looked like a stable indulgence starts to look more like an increasingly expensive ecological gamble. And you can already see the strain showing up in everyday life. Bars get smaller, recipes change, fillers and substitute fats creep in, prices rise while quality slips. The familiar chocolate people thought would always be there is quietly changing in front of them. The truth is simple: the system is under stress. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes harder to ignore. If the environmental cost is this high, what human cost has been buried alongside it? Part 4. The bitter cost of sweetness. Because the crisis surrounding chocolate is not only about climate, water, or carbon, there is another layer to this story, and it is much harder to swallow. Behind the sweetness, behind the glossy packaging and the comfort people associate with chocolate, there is a labor system that has been criticized for decades and still has not been meaningfully repaired. In West Africa, where so much of the world's cacao is grown, investigations and reports have continued to document hazardous child labor on cocoa farms. For years, major chocolate companies made public commitments, signed agreements, and promised reform. The Harkin-Engel Protocol was signed back in 2001 with the goal of ending the worst forms of child labor in cocoa production by 2005. That deadline passed. Then came new promises, new target dates, and more missed deadlines. The words changed, but the pattern did not. And when you step back and look at the economics, the reason becomes painfully clear. Cheap chocolate depends on raw material being produced at prices that leave growers with very little room to live, let alone invest in better labor conditions, better soil care, better infrastructure, or long-term security. A small farmer in Côte d'Ivoire, working just a couple of hectares, may earn only a tiny daily income, while prices are shaped far away in financial markets the grower does not control. The farmer carries the weather risk, the disease risk, the yield risk, and often the market risk too. That is what makes this so difficult to solve from inside the same system. When a product is built on squeezing costs lower and lower at the production end, human dignity becomes one of the first things sacrificed. So when people ask why the problem continues after so many public promises, the uncomfortable answer is that the structure keeps rewarding the same behavior. The industry does not merely contain the problem. In many ways, the industry helps create it. And that brings us to a turning point in this story. Because once you see the ecological strain and the human cost side by side, Carob stops looking like an odd, old-fashioned substitute. It starts to look like a completely different model of abundance. Part 5. Carob as the ultimate climate survivor. This is where the conversation changes. Up to this point, we have been looking at fragility, fragile supply chains, fragile weather patterns, fragile economics. But Carob offers almost the opposite picture. If cacao is a tree that asks for very specific tropical conditions, Carob is a tree that has learned how to endure. Carob is a true drought-adapted species, a plant built for long, dry summers, lean soils, and hard conditions that would stress or kill more delicate crops. As a grower, that matters enormously. This is the kind of tree that sends roots deep, searches for moisture far below the surface, and settles into the landscape instead of constantly demanding that the grower rescue it. Once established, a healthy carob tree can live with very little irrigation. In a future where water is becoming one of agriculture's greatest limits, that is not a small advantage. That is a defining one. It also thrives in places people often overlook: rocky ground, alkaline soils, marginal sites where other fruit trees struggle to justify the effort. And that is one of the reasons I find it so fascinating from a long-term gardening perspective. Carob does not ask for perfect land. It makes use of land that many other crops reject. Even its relationship with fire has drawn attention in Mediterranean regions. With its moisture-holding tissues and tough structure, it can function more like a resisting presence in a hot, dry landscape than a tree eager to ignite. Add to that the fact that a mature carob tree can capture a meaningful amount of carbon each year, and you begin to see why this species belongs in any serious conversation about climate-resilient agriculture. And unlike heavily industrial crops, carob does not need the same parade of inputs and infrastructure to become useful. No endless stream of irrigation, no constant chemical dependence, no fragile global chain of refrigerated transport just to move value from one side of the planet to another. Under the right conditions, the tree simply grows, holds the hillside, shades the soil, and produces. That is the quiet power of carob. It is not flashy, it is not fragile, it does not beg for attention. It just keeps surviving season after season, where many other crops begin to fail. And once you realize that, the next logical question is the one every home grower eventually asks. If this tree is so resilient, can I plant one myself? Part 6. Planting your own independence. And this is the part I love most because the story finally comes back to the garden. For all the money, machinery, branding, and global supply chains wrapped around sweetness, the simplest truth is this. In the right climate, you can grow this tree yourself. Not in a laboratory, not in some industrial plantation, but in your own soil, with your own hands. And once you understand what carob needs, you realize it asks for far less than most fruiting trees. If you live in USDA zones 9 through 11, places like Southern California, Arizona, parts of Texas, Florida, or Hawaii, carob can do beautifully. It handles sandy ground, clay-heavy soil, rocky pockets, and even alkaline conditions that make many productive trees struggle. From a grower's point of view, that kind of flexibility is gold. The one thing it will not tolerate is poor drainage. Let its roots sit in standing water, and you will quickly see the limits of its toughness. Give it drainage, sun, and time, and it starts to show you what resilience really looks like. Now, there is one detail every home gardener needs to know before planting. Carob trees are dioecious, which means male and female flowers grow on separate trees. The males provide pollen, the females produce the pods. So yes, you can start from seed, and seed is inexpensive, but it comes with a gamble. If you wait 6 or 8 years for that seedling to mature, and it turns out to be male, you may end up with a handsome shade tree and no harvest at all. That is why, in practical terms, a grafted tree is usually the smarter choice. A grafted carob comes from a known female line, which means you are not guessing about sex, and it will usually begin producing much sooner, often in just 3 to 4 years. If you can find named cultivars, varieties like Clifford are known for large, sweet pods. Santa Fe is often appreciated for a little more cold tolerance, and Tantalo has long been valued for the deep sweetness bakers love. Once planted, the early years are simple but important. Water deeply about once a week while the tree is establishing. Encourage those roots to travel downward, and resist the urge to pamper it too much. By the time the tree matures, you want it adapted to the site, not dependent on constant attention. That is the beauty of carob. It rewards patience more than fussing. No endless spraying routine, no desperate chemical rescue plan, no exhausting maintenance cycle. Just a strong tree settling into its place and preparing to feed you for decades. And once it does begin to produce, that is when the real abundance starts to show. Part 7. From pod to pantry. When late summer begins to lean into fall, the tree tells you it is ready. The pods darken, dry on the branches, and take on that deep brown color that hints at the sweetness inside. Harvesting is refreshingly low-tech. Spread a tarp beneath the canopy, give the branches a careful shake, and let the pods come down. A mature tree can produce an astonishing amount over time, enough to make you stop thinking of it as a novelty and start seeing it as a serious pantry crop. And this is where carob becomes especially exciting for anyone who loves useful plants. Once the pods are harvested, the process is simple. Remove the seeds, that same tiny seed that helped define the carrot, and grind the remaining pod pulp into powder. That powder stores beautifully and does not demand refrigeration, which is exactly the kind of practical food resilience so many gardeners and homesteaders are trying to build back into their lives. But raw carob powder is only the beginning. Roast it gently, and the flavor deepens in a way that surprises people who have only ever known bland health food versions. A short time in the oven can bring out darker, richer notes that lean toward chocolate, caramel, and even a hint of coffee-like depth. You can also simmer crushed pods in water and reduce the liquid into a thick, glossy carob syrup, a traditional Mediterranean food that has been around far longer than modern spreads and dessert sauces. Spoon it over oatmeal, swirl it into yogurt, or blend it with tahini, and suddenly this old survival crop feels incredibly current again. And then there are the seeds. Most people would throw them aside, but even they hold value. With enough effort and the right processing, they connect back to the same locust bean gum the food industry has depended on for so long. The thickener that gives body and silkiness to everything from ice cream to smoothies. When you step back and look at the whole tree, that is what makes it so remarkable. You are not just growing a sweet pod. You are growing a shelf-stable pantry ingredient, a syrup source, a baking powder, and a plant tied directly to one of the world's most widely used food additives. That is not a backyard novelty. That is real productivity. And once you see that, it becomes easier to understand why the wider world is beginning to take carob seriously again. Part 8. The cocoa-free revolution and reclaiming our food. Around the world, more people are waking up to the fact that cacao is vulnerable, expensive, and increasingly difficult to rely on. And that realization has sparked a new wave of innovation. Startups in Europe and North America are now racing to create cocoa-free chocolate, using ingredients like carob, barley, and oats to recreate the taste, texture, and snap people expect, but with a much lighter environmental footprint. In Italy, companies are finding ways to use upcycled carob pulp in patented new products. In other words, the market is finally beginning to notice what this tree has been offering all along. But here is the part that matters most to me, and maybe to you as well. You do not need venture capital, a food lab, or a trademark to join this shift. You do not need to wait for a company to give you permission to rediscover a plant your ancestors might have recognized immediately. A pod does not care about branding. A tree does not care about patents. If you have a suitable climate, a patch of land, and the patience to plant for the long term, you can participate in this quiet revolution yourself. One grower with a few trees may not shake a global industry, but many growers spread across neighborhoods, backyards, dry hillsides, and home orchards begin to tell a different story about what food can be. Not a story built on extraction and distance, but one built on place, resilience, and local abundance. That is the part industrial systems rarely know how to respond to. They understand commodities, they understand control, but they do not understand what happens when ordinary people start growing overlooked plants that meet real needs without asking much in return. For 4,000 years, the carob tree has kept doing the same simple thing. It has grown through droughts, empires, migrations, and market changes. It grew when older worlds rose and fell, and it is still here now, waiting at the edge of modern agriculture, like a lesson we almost forgot. And that brings us to the final question, the one that reaches beyond chocolate and straight into the future of how we choose to feed ourselves. Conclusion: the infinite harvest. We are standing at a remarkable crossroads in the story of food. For generations, the modern chocolate system taught us to believe that sweetness had to come packaged with scarcity, with exploitation, with ecological strain hidden somewhere far from view. It taught us to think indulgence was only possible through fragile supply chains, exhausted landscapes, and people we would never meet carrying the cost. But nature keeps offering another path. Carob does not arrive with the stimulant rush of cacao, and maybe that is exactly the point. It offers a different kind of sweetness, steady, earthy, generous, and rooted in a tree that asks for little once established. It invites us to stop treating it as a replacement and start seeing it for what it truly is: a productive, climate-wise, deeply useful tree with a long memory and a long future. If you live in a warm region and have even a modest piece of ground, then you have the chance to plant more than a crop. You can plant shade, food, resilience, and continuity. A carob tree planted today may outlive you by decades. It may still be dropping pods long after today's market headlines are forgotten. There is something deeply grounding in that. In a world obsessed with speed, this tree still works on the timescale of legacy. So let me leave you with this thought. The next time you taste something sweet, ask yourself not only what it tastes like, but what system produced it, what landscape supported it, and what future it encourages. Because every garden is a vote, every tree is a choice, and every choice shapes the world we hand forward. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Earthly Delights. If you enjoy uncovering the useful plant's history pushed to the side, subscribe to the channel, keep caring for your soil, keep planting with purpose, and I'll see you in the next one.